This is my mother. And ever since I was about this old, my mom has been hinting about how much she would love an outdoor shower. And now that I know enough to be dangerous with construction, I'm gonna try to make it happen. And this shower is gonna be sick. I promise you it's not gonna look like this.
This project is gonna involve a bunch of excavation, which we've already kind of started. It's gonna involve plumbing, it's gonna involve concrete, and a whole bunch more. So let's get to work. So here's where this project starts. This is where we're gonna build the project. And first, we gotta start with some excavation.
So there used to be a fig bush right here, and I thought it would be a nice shallow root system, but these roots were no joke. So my dad came through clutch and he coordinated a quick rental for this mini excavator, which probably saved us a whole day worth of excavation. Essentially, we needed to remove around 10 inches of dirt from the area, and then we just compacted the soil and gave ourselves a pretty solid, firm base to build off of. I'm gonna be building a concrete shower perimeter that's essentially a 6 foot by 4 foot rectangle, so I'm cutting the 2-inch by 6-inch lumber to size so it can serve as my forms. I secured the forms together using a handful of screws, and I used an 8-inch piece of blocking to offset the inner form from the outer form to make sure it's uniform. Get it? Now that we have the forms built, I put them in place preliminarily so we can talk about drainage. Most outdoor showers are positioned a couple feet away from the foundation, so you can just have the water freely flowing through gravel or decking boards or whatever. But because our shower is going to be right up near the home's foundation, we got to get that water away. So after determining the center drain location, I took a piece of 2-inch pipe that's 10 feet long, and I marked the perimeter of where I was going to need to excavate that drain piping. And fortunately, this took place the same day we had the excavator, so digging that trench was no big deal. I started shallow at about 1 foot, and at its deepest it was probably 3.5 feet. Then I grabbed some geotextile or filter fabric or landscape fabric, whatever y'all yuppies want to call it, and then I put in a little gravel layer just to hold it in place. And obviously we're gonna need this drain slope, so we have the highest point near the drain and the lowest point at the end. Then I drilled a bunch of these little holes in the pipe to serve as perforations so that when we fill it up with water, it'll drain out through those perforations as well as the end. Then I glued this 90-degree bend on. This is where it's gonna go vertical, and we're just going to leave that as a long stub up until we actually have our drain ready to be installed. And then I backfilled with enough stone just to hold everything in place while I tested this thing out.
Okay, so right now we're doing the old drain test. So I have the hose going in, and as you can see, working pretty good. We have the holes cut out at the bottom, so we got our perforations there. And then if we go to the other side, you can see that the majority of the water is coming out of the pipe here, which is what we want. So we have those little perforations on the side, coming all the way down, starting at that ditch there. And so far, we have really good drainage into the stone. So I have a pretty good feeling about this drain setup.
And after ensuring I have at least a 1/4 inch per foot of slope, I have way more than that, I backfilled the rest of that piping. No going back now. This is what we got. And the reason I used that geotextile fabric is I just didn't want a bunch of dirt and stuff to end up clogging the holes later on. So I wrapped up the stone with the geotextile before backfilling with dirt. It was probably overkill, but I'll sleep better at night. And after giving myself a 4-inch stone sub base, I compacted everything with a hand tamp, and we can finally pour that perimeter concrete curb. And do your best to get the stone relatively flat, but doesn't need to be perfect. With the base compacted, I brought in the concrete forms. That was a bit of a pain in the butt to get it around that deck support column, but once I unscrewed it and screwed it back together, we were all set.
Okay, so at this point, we're almost ready to pour. So let me show you what I'm doing here. So we have a piece of blocking cut at 8 inches, right? So this is our 8-inch piece of blocking. This is gonna make sure that we're in good shape all the way around. So that blocking is 8 inches, and that should fit around the entire perimeter here on this side and on that side. Now for the outer form, we need to make sure it's square, meaning that this measurement from that diagonal to this diagonal needs to be the same as that diagonal to this diagonal.
To confirm square, just run a tape measure from corner to corner and make sure you have the same measurement on both sides. And after confirming square, we are so close to being able to pour the perimeter. But I want to run some rebar just to reinforce the concrete around the perimeter, so I'm using a Sawzall with a metal blade to cut it about halfway through and snapping it.
We have the rebar in. I tied that together using some rebar ties. I'm using some bricks here basically as rebar chairs to get that in the center of the curb that we're going to pour. And then obviously that's connected all the way around. Okay, so we are finally ready to start pouring concrete on this curb surround here. Like always, I'm using Rapid Cess 24/6 concrete mix, and we're gonna mix everything up using the mud mixer. So the first thing we need to do for the mud mixer is connect the water supply hose. Next up, we gotta plug it in. And for this project, I have the pleasure of using the chute extension for the first time. So I'll go ahead and put that on there. right there, and that's going to give me a longer chute, obviously, to reach my forms. And lastly, we have the hopper extension, which is going to allow me to load more bags of concrete at a time, and that's just going to make everything more convenient and time efficient. We're going to do a little bit of mist in the forms to make sure that our concrete doesn't dry out immediately.
And while my dad was telling me about how they used to mix concrete back in his day with a wheelbarrow and a fork, I was loading up the mud mixer with some 24/6 concrete mix. And after getting 4 bags of the 24/6 rapid setting concrete loaded into the mud mixer, we adjusted the water supply and turned the auger on. It's go time. Thanks to the mud mixer, I was able to get this entire form area filled with concrete in around 20 minutes or so, and it wasn't super labor intensive besides loading the bags. It got a little bit runny in a spot or two, but after adjusting the amount of water coming out of the nozzles, got it back to a good consistency. And then I used a shovel to make sure that I was filling all of the gaps in the form. And after filling it up, I just used a concrete finishing trowel and a edging trowel to give a rounded edge and a smooth surface. Concrete finishing is an art, so don't get the wrong idea that this was super easy. It takes a little bit of practice to get a smooth edge. And after letting the concrete cure overnight, I came back the next day and removed the forms. And as you can see, when I pull out these forms, the concrete work was not fantastic, but it's all good. It's going to be backfilled around the edge anyways. Next up, I cut off the stub to the appropriate height, and then I used some PVC primer and glue to secure the shower drain that I bought off Amazon. I'll link that down below. And then you're going to use a level on both sides to make sure that when you set the shower drain, it's perfectly level. I didn't nail this, but it was pretty close. So obviously we need to slope the shower pan from the edges to the center drain. So to do that, I placed a laser level on the shower drain. That horizontal laser line is about 2 inches higher than the shower drain. It gives me a ledger line that I can attach a 1x2 around the entire perimeter. And then if I slope from the top of that 1x2 down to the drain, I'll have a nice sloped pan. And after wetting down the stone base, it's time to pour the concrete shower pan. To pour the concrete shower pan, I 110% needed a fast setting concrete. Otherwise, this was not going to be possible. So 24/6 concrete mix in the mud mixer was again the perfect recipe for success for this shower pan, and here's why. In order to actually slope the concrete, first you need a pretty dry concrete mix. So if it ended up being a little bit runny, all I had to do was wait a few minutes and the rapid setting concrete would kind of set up and harden so that I could slope it from the edge to the shower drain. As you can see, I'm using that ledger board on the perimeter as the high point, and then I'm using the shower drain as the reference for how low I need to be. And then I'm just using a finishing trowel to try to make that as gradual of a transition as possible. And after sloping that side, I filled the rest of the form area up with concrete. Again, this is rapid setting concrete, very important, and I tried to pour it as dry as possible so that it would set up quickly and I could form the slope. And fortunately, my brother Ryan was coming over for a little dinner gathering at my parents' house, so he was able to help me out with the finishing touches for getting the shower pan sloped. And after letting the shower pan concrete cure for around 20 minutes, I cut out the shower drain using an old Sawzall blade, and after prying the drain out, I cleaned up the edges and put a drain plug in so that I don't clog up the drain plumbing.
Okay, so the last thing we have to do here is pour the little landing. So you're gonna walk onto it and then hop in the shower. So we have it formed out, and we're gonna make it flush with that existing patio and pour this in. We're gonna put a little bit of stone in and then some rebar and then pour.
And every concrete pour is pretty much the same. You're gonna compact, you're gonna put in a stone sub base, you're gonna compact again, then you're gonna set up your reinforcement, tie everything together using some rebar ties. You can also use steel wire mesh for this, and then you're gonna pour. And for the last time this project, we're using 24/6 concrete and the mud mixer for one final pour. After getting half of the form area filled with concrete, I put in the rebar grid, pushed that into place, and then I filled the rest of the form area with concrete. And after screeding the surface smooth with a 2x4 and using a finishing trowel and an edging trowel to get the edges and the surface clean, I gave this pad a broom finish because I want to add a little bit of traction. I don't want anybody slipping when it's wet and they're getting in and out of the shower. And after letting the concrete cure overnight, I removed the forms and we are officially done with concrete on this project, thank God. And although we could just seal the concrete in the shower pan and call it a day, it's my mom we're talking about. We gotta tile this thing. My mom picked out some large format tiles for this shower pan, and whenever I'm doing a large format tile layout, I like to rip down a couple strips of 2x4 lumber. After mutilating the 2x4s, I take the strips over to the shower pan, position them in place around the perimeter, and then I'll usually use an oscillating tool just to cut them to size around the perimeter perimeter. I also created a box around the shower drain, but more on that after we glue the perimeter pieces together using some hot glue. You could also use some construction adhesive, but hot glue sets up the fastest. Now for the shower drain, you're essentially creating a template so you know the exact location of that drain. So I'm checking the offset, making sure that I'm perfectly centered on both sides. Then we're going to glue those two longer pieces in place before taking the two shorter pieces and marking the other two sides of the shower drain. Again, we're just marking the perimeter. We want this to be a template that we can use to cut the tile later on. Here's a look at the shower drain from above, and as you can see, the template is a perfect cutout of that drain. Now we're going to take the tiles and we're going to set them out on a flat surface. Make sure that you put the spacers in place. I'm using 1/8 inch spacers here. Then we're going to take that template, move it over to the tiles, and place it over top. I like to position the center drain so that it's right at the intersection between 4 tiles. And after checking that your template is perfectly centered, you're gonna mark the perimeter using a Sharpie or a pencil. I like to use a Sharpie for the large rectangle perimeter and then a pencil for the shower drain, since a Sharpie might end up being visible if you don't make your cut perfect. After marking the perimeter and the shower drain, remove the template in preparation for marking the relief, also known as envelope cuts, on the tile. For large format tiles, you need to cut relief cuts, otherwise it's not going to work with the slope of the shower drain. To mark these cuts, take a straight edge and align one side so that it intersects with the corner of the shower drain and the other side so that it intersects with the corner of the shower pan. And then you're just going to make that mark. I'm using a pencil here, and you're going to do that for all 4 of the relief cuts you're going to need to make. After marking all the cut lines, I used a wet tile saw to make all my cuts, but there are a bunch of different other ways to cut tile. For more information on tiling, ways to cut it, etc., you can check out my other 2 videos here, and I'll link them down in the description. And after making each cut, I performed a dry fit by placing the tile in its corresponding location within the shower pan. And after finishing up with all of the straight cuts on the larger tiles, I cut the small areas around the shower drain using an angle grinder, since it's hard to cut those small little intricate cuts on a tile saw like I was using previously. So an angle grinder with a ceramic wheel on there is going to do you just fine for making these smaller cuts around the shower drain. And after cutting all the tile to size, I used some sanding blocks to sand down all the rough edges and make sure that they were nice and smooth. After getting all the tiles dry fit, I want to take a look at the shower drain, and this model that I ordered has an adjustable collar, so make sure that you adjust the height so that the floor drain when you put it in is flush with the surrounding tile. Now to actually attach the tile to the concrete shower pan, we're using Rapid Set's all tile mortar, which is great for large format tiles like we're installing here. So I'm going to add water and mix this up per the manufacturer's instructions. And I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch square notch trowel to apply the thin set mortar to the pan. The reason I went with 1/2 inch is because there's some irregularities with this pan, and I want to make sure that I have a thick mortar bed underneath so the tiles are fully supported. And after adding a thin layer of back butter to the back side of the tiles, I position them in place based on the layout. Again, I'm using 1/8 inch spacers here, and I'm leaving an 1/8 of an inch gap around the perimeter for expansion and contraction. And the process for setting these tiles is pretty straightforward. A thin layer of back butter on the back side of the tiles using the flat side of the trowel, position the tile in place, insert the spacer in between, and I'm using a system called the Spin Doctor, which is a tile leveling system, and I have more information on the entire shower pan tiling process on my channel. I'll link these 3 videos down in the description. But I want to show you guys the shower drain before moving on. So after adjusting the collar and confirming that the shower drain was at the right height and flush with the surrounding tile, I applied a bunch of thinset mortar to the area around the drain. And I also back buttered a bunch of thinset on the back side of the drain before turning it over and pushing it into place. And although this looks like the Play-Doh Play Factory or whatever that toy was where you kind of push it in and everything oozes out through, I promise you that all this thinset is going to ensure that this thing never moves. And after removing all of the Rapid Set all tile mortar using the back side of the trowel, I used a sponge to clean up any of the remaining thinset that wasn't supposed to be there. This rapid setting thinset needs 5 hours before I can grout, so let's install the supply piping for the shower in the meantime. And naturally, I had to go in my parents' terrifying crawl space to make this happen.
All right, I'm in the dark, scary crawl space. We have a cold water here and we have a hot water running parallel, and I think I'm gonna tie into it like right there. So that's where my hot water is gonna come from. My cold water, fortunately, is all the way over there where the hose is. So that one should be a lot easier. So I loosened the support right there, and then over here there was another one that I removed. So that should give me enough slack to bend this pipe around the T that I'm gonna add now. So I got my T right here. I'm gonna go ahead and position it in place and then mark where I'm gonna need to cut this. So those are my 2 marks. And I have this cutter tool.
So after turning off the water in the house, I use this snap cutter to cut through the 3/4 inch CPVC. I let that drain out a bit, and then I cut the other side so that I could prime and glue the 3/4 inch line by 1/2 inch branch CPVC T into place. Next, I marked the hollow cavities in the cinder block so I could drill through and get from the crawl space to the home's exterior and route those 1/2 inch CPVC lines to the shower. I glued the 90-degree bends on from the exterior and then just pushed those pipes in as far as they would go so that when I went back in the crawl space, I would know exactly where to make my tie-ins. So for this cold water here, I just cut out a segment again so that I could install my 1/2 inch T. And with the T in place, I cut this final spool piece, and I also added a 1/2 inch ball valve so that I could shut off the water to prevent freezing during the winter. And the plumbing, once I got out of the crawl space, was a piece of cake. You're just gonna prime and glue all the CPVC together. And let me know down in the comments if you think CPVC was the right material choice here. You could also use PEX and maybe something else, but I've always used CPVC, but I feel like people hate on that material for whatever reason. And at the end here, I glued on a 1/2 inch threaded coupling so that I can attach that to the shower head later on. And now that it's been 5 hours and the thin set has cured, I can go in and I can kick off these tile leveling clips. This is honestly probably one of the most satisfying parts of this entire build, is just kicking these things off, especially if you got a little anger built up from one of the previous steps. And if you're a messy tiler like me, you're probably gonna have to spend a few minutes cleaning out any of the excess thin set mortar that made its way in between your grout lines. I'll link the tools I use down in the description, then just vacuum out all the joints. And vacuuming out all the dust and debris from the grout lines, also weirdly satisfying. And with all of the grout lines cleaned up, we can mix up our grout. And for this project, we're just using some leftover gray grout that I had from another tiling project. And we're just gonna apply this sanded grout into all the grout lines, pushing it into place with a grout float and trying to clean off the excess with the grout float before wiping off any additional excess with a sponge. Grouting around the shower drain is the same. You're just going to push grout into all the gaps between the shower drain and the surrounding tile. Clean up the majority of excess with the float and then wipe everything clean with a damp sponge. And just like with thin set mortar, it's always easier to clean this up when it's wet, so take your time and clean up any of the grout haze at this point and don't try to scrape it off later.
For the walls of the shower, we're going to be using this Hoft privacy panel system, which comes with the vertical post you're seeing right here, and then we have this composite board, which is essentially going to be a slat that we're just going to slide down right in there. So this is pretty similar to what I did for the privacy screen outside by my trash cans, but I can already tell this is going to be much simpler.
So to install these vertical posts, we first need to mount the base plate using these hex screws. We're going to tighten those up, and here's the first one, and here's a quicker version of the second one.
So we got our corner post right here. We'll go ahead and install it in the orientation that we need. Just kind of eyeballing it for now.
Then I'm going to use a tape measure to make sure I'm perfectly centered within that concrete curb, and then taking a level to give me a right angle so I know exactly where to position that post. And then I'm marking all of the anchor bolt locations using a pencil.
Once we have the bolt locations marked, we'll remove the pole, and we're going to be anchoring all of the posts with this 3/8 inch by 3 1/4 inch post anchor. I'm going to be using a hammer drill to drill into the concrete, and I have the depth set so that the entire bolt will be into the concrete. You can adjust this as needed, but I want to make sure that I have enough depth.
Now, all we got to do is drill, which I'm going to let play out in a little montage. And then we'll just repeat that for the other post, and then you're going to want to vacuum out all the concrete dust before actually placing the post back in place and inserting all of your anchor bolts. So I was really in a hurry to get this front wall put together so that I could get the shower head mounted and just see what everything would look like. So I marked the midpoint of the wall using a tape measure and a level, and this is a Vigo shower panel, and it has a hanging bracket on the top and bottom, so I marked the locations for those brackets, and I attached them to the wall by pre-drilling and then putting a bolt all the way through to the back side of those panels, and then just tightening everything up with a nut. Next, I had to cut a hole in the wall so that I could run the hose from the front side to the back side. So I took off those panels and I made one of the most off-putting, heinous cuts with a Sawzall I think I've ever made, but no sweat, it's going to be covered up by that Vigo shower panel. So after putting all the slats back in place and making a few minor adjustments, it was time for the moment of truth, and I lifted the shower panel in place, got it attached to the brackets, and then I just connected the hoses to the CPVC threaded connection. And this Vigo shower panel comes with a hand wand as well, so I just got that installed and mounted to the wall at this point just to get it over with. And after getting that front wall and the shower panel installed, I moved on to install the Hoft privacy panels on the other remaining 4 walls. The process for setting these vertical posts is really easy. You're just going to pre-drill all the holes, vacuum out any of the dust, position the post in place, and then insert the expansion anchors. The tricky part is making sure that the post is perfectly plumb after you install those bolts, and you might need to shim one or multiple sides in order to make that happen. So make the adjustments, use a post level to make sure your posts are perfectly level, and And once you're happy with how everything looks, you can tighten up the bolts using a wrench or just a socket wrench. And finally, you can trim off the excess shims using a utility knife or an oscillating tool just to give the posts a clean look. Next, I'm going to take the stops that come with the Hoff privacy panel system, and I'm going to establish those 6 inches above the concrete curb so that when I put the slats in place, they'll be perfectly level and 6 inches above the ground, which I think is the cleanest look. And if you're using the Hoff composite boards, you want to make sure you put in the central connectors between each board to prevent warping over time. All of those boards were full length, but for this back wall here, I'm going to have to cut a bunch of these composite boards. So after getting the measurements, I set up a pretty low rent stop block using this table, and I cut all those boards to size using a miter saw. This was a pretty fun part of the project because after putting in the panels on this second wall, I could finally start seeing the shower come together. Now for this last post, which is going to butt up against the vertical support column for the deck, I was going to have a gap if I left the full base in there. So instead, I cut off this small section using an angle grinder, bolted it to the concrete, and then screwed it at the top. And after cutting the Hoff composite panels to length and inserting them in between the two posts, all there's left to do is build the shower door. So I think my design for this door was actually pretty sweet. So first, I cut off 6 inches at the bottom of each post so that it would match the walls on either side. And then I cut a bunch of the composite panels to length and sandwiched them between the two posts. Next, I took some 1/2 inch all thread, I spray painted it black, then I pre-drilled through each of the posts and then slid that 1/2 inch all thread through one post all the way through to the other post so that I could put a nut and a washer on either side, essentially sandwiching those two posts together and all the boards in between. Oh, and I cut the all thread to length using a miter saw. I just took it out after test fitting. After building the gate, I lifted it up and held it in place temporarily using some clamps before pre-drilling the holes for the hinges and putting the bolts through. On the back side of those bolts, I installed a washer and a nut. This hardware was readily available at Home Depot. I realized it wasn't the best. And after securing the other side of the hinges, I cut off the excess bolt length. And at this point, we're finally getting to the final touches. So I caulked around the perimeter of the tile and the concrete surround, and then I smoothed out all the edges using a caulking tool. And then I put these Hoff post caps on all the posts and tightened them up using an Allen wrench. For the gate latch, I used this fancy little tool to mark the locations where I needed to pre-drill my holes. Then I painted all the hardware black. I installed this double-sided gate latch, which I will link down in the description. I got it off Amazon, and then I trimmed off the excess bolt length again using a Sawzall. I installed the latch on the door in a similar fashion, using that tool to give myself a small indent to keep the drill bit from wandering all over the place. Then I just tightened everything up. And Hoff manufactures a bunch of accessories for this privacy panel system like shelves and towel hooks, so I installed a few of those. And finally, my mom made me install a handle on the door. Now let's take a quick reminder look at where this project started. Whoa, too far. And here is a look at the final result. Despite a couple mistakes, I'm pretty happy with how this outdoor shower turned out. My mom unfortunately would not sign the video release, so you gotta take my word for it that she really enjoys the outdoor shower. And if you guys enjoyed this video, I really would appreciate if you could drop a like down below and consider subscribing to the channel if you like DIY content like this. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Peace.